Good morning. So full disclosure, I was really excited about this morning. I was really excited about the material. And then about 2 minutes ago, I just had this, and I'll tell you guys, I don't get nervous. I've never been nervous to speak in front of people. But I had this moment of like, man, with everything that we're going to go over today, this could bomb terribly. Because there's a lot to it. And last night I was having a little moment of kind of anxiety. And so I emailed the notes to Scott, and I'm like, man, I hope this makes sense. I'm still not convinced it will. Last week, if you'll remember, we talked about in Proverbs 4:23, it says, guard your heart. And the word heart is mentioned 97 times in Proverbs. And so we broke it down into categories. 41% of the time when it says heart, it talks about your reasoning. So what the verse is saying is guard your reasoning. That you have to be able to work through the reasoning behind why you believe what you believe. And it's an interesting one because so badly I want to avoid, and I don't always, there are times where current events dictate that you at least have some sort of a response. You know, I don't want to be the preacher who always, no matter what's going on in current events, always has some quippy little sermon to sort of try to stay relevant. And so I don't like the idea of preaching based on current events, but every now and then something comes up and it creates questions. You'll see something that creates questions, and if you're a believer, you will be asked questions by your friends based on what you see going on in the world. And where better than church to at least sort of look into some answers based on the concept of guarding our reasoning. So what we're going to try to do is answer a few questions that in my mind deserve an answer. We're seeing some stuff. It's been a weird year, and we've seen some things go on that create questions. And recently, as you guys are all aware, someone walked into a church with a gun, right? Imagine if you're going to guard your reasoning, this is a good opportunity because the question will arise, are we all just being fooled? Is it possible that we're all being duped, that the whole God thing is possibly just a setup? Because if there is the God that we talk about, and he's unwilling to protect a church full of people that are there to worship him, as you guard your reasoning, those are the sort of questions that are going to begin to kind of chip away at your reasoning as you make an effort to guard your heart. Been up here for 3 minutes and we're getting right into it, aren't we? Because if we don't ask those questions, listen, if you're somebody who is willing to say, I don't know, I just trust God blindly, that is not unintelligent faith. Don't let anybody tell you that it is. Don't let anybody tell you that by saying, I don't know, but I trust God anyway, that's unintelligent. That is faith exemplified. So when we make an effort to answer the tough questions, it's not so that we'll have a better argument for the doubters, because I don't believe in building better arguments. But I just want to guard my reasoning. I want to know that we've at least examined some of the tough questions, and that if that's what you're interested in, if you're interested, go, okay, I believe, but help me understand, how could a loving God allow things that we're seeing? I want to at least know that we have taken a minute to examine the why behind our faith. Fair enough? This is why I'm afraid it could be a really rough morning, because if this goes the way I think it's going to go, we're spending a lot of time thinking, and it's going to be very, very quiet. And when the room is very, very quiet, rabbit trails just go everywhere. So throw out an amen every now and then for my sake. So here's the question. Did God create everything? You're going to get asked this at some point if you defend your faith at all, if you believe in your faith at all. Did God create everything? Of course, the answer we would say is yes. Second question is, does evil exist? So, okay, in the same line of questioning, if evil exists and God created everything, how could a good God create evil, right? It's a fair question. It's one of those questions that if you're in a supermarket and somebody drops these questions on you, you're going to be like, oh, look at it's 2 o'clock, I got a thing. But it's a fair question. So I want to guard our reasoning. I want to understand at least why we answered these questions the way that we do, and then you do with it what you want. I hate to blame everything on Adam and Eve. When you start looking at evil, the cause and the effect of evil, I hate to blame everything on Adam and Eve. But to quote my 5-year-old self, they started it. And so if you go back far enough, here's what I want to know is that by sinning, what did Adam and Eve actually choose? If we could figure out what Adam and Eve actually chose, we're going to better understand evil. And if you look at evil, like the ingredients of evil, what are the ingredients of evil? Adam and Eve would tell you it's made up of fruit. But even the fruit is more of a result. And you think of everything associated with evil, you think of like murder and greed and envy and all these things, that's still not the ingredients of evil. So it doesn't help us understand what Adam and Eve chose. We see the result of evil in their heart was that they chose to defy God. They chose to disobey. They got banished from the garden. But those are all the results. And if we trace it back and we ask, what is evil? What is it made of? What are the ingredients that go into evil? Because if God's a good God and if God created everything, then where do we put all that? Where do we go with those tough questions like why is evil even a thing? I'm going to stick to my notes because otherwise it's going to be a long morning. We think of Adam and Eve's punishment as being banished from the garden, right? What was the punishment of Adam and Eve when they sinned? They got kicked out of the garden. But that's not really the full story. The fullness of the punishment was that they got removed from God's presence. That was the punishment. That through disobedience, through their choices, through choosing disobedience, they found themselves severed from the presence of God. That was the punishment. The garden was just a result. So if we're asking, what did Adam and Eve choose? What did they choose? When they chose evil, what did they choose? At least in part, what they chose was a separation from God. That evil in its beginning, in its inception in humanity, that the choice was made to sever their relationship with God. So if we're looking, and this will start to make sense in a minute, but we've got to ask the questions because it does no good to start answering questions if we don't understand the question first. They chose disobedience. They chose separation from God. You follow me so far? Puzzle gets even harder because 1 Timothy 4:4 says this, for everything God created is good. Are we more confused now? Did God create everything? Yes. Is evil a thing? Yes. How could a good God create evil if everything that God created is good? I read something this week that said, if you have a little bit of science, it makes it hard to believe in God. But if you have a lot of science, it makes it impossible to doubt him. And I think these questions are the first step in questioning. But if you go even further, what you find is that every ounce of our reasoning, if we guard our reasoning, if everything gets taken into perspective, this morning I want to solidify my stance and my belief in God based on reasoning, even through the difficult questions. Okay, so it kind of starts right now. We're assembling puzzle pieces. I've been studying Augustine this week, and it's spelled Augustine, but St. Augustine is a town in Florida. Augustine was a philosopher. Learned that this week. Kind of proud of myself. Anyway, philosophy, let me tell you, philosophy is not something you want to preach. Philosophy is confusing because you're answering and asking a lot of different questions, and it can become very confusing, and there's going to be some of that this morning. Philosophy would be this, and I am going to quote Mary McLean. She said, if you clean your vacuum, does that make you a vacuum cleaner? And I would say that's a good example of philosophy. Yeah. That's stupid. Augustine said this about evil. Augustine said he had a thesis on evil, and I actually tend to believe that he's right. And I'm just going to tell you some of what he said, and based on that, I want to walk through some answers of, did God create everything? Is evil a thing? And how could a good God create evil? He said this, what are the ingredients of evil? His answer is this, the ingredients of evil, there are none. There's no ingredients to evil, none whatsoever. Evil in and of itself isn't a thing. It's nothing. It's the opposite of a thing. Evil is the lack of something, not the presence of something else. Now follow me for a second. If we were to turn the lights off and nobody could see, we would say that it is dark. But in reality, there is also no such thing as dark. There's only the presence or the absence of light. Follow me? Cold. There's actually, if we walked outside and we started shivering, we would say that it is. So we understand the concept of cold, we understand the concept of dark, but science tells us there's no way to measure cold. There's only ways to measure the presence of heat or the lack of heat. So Augustine, he said that evil works this exact same way, that we all see the effects of somebody operating at an evil standpoint, but because we identify evil as being a thing rather than being nothing, we get confused. We don't understand how God could have created evil if he's a good God, and especially when we see the effects of evil or dark or especially cold. How could a good God create cold? That would mean this. I know this isn't a typical sermon, but I think there's good enough stuff in here, and we're going to record it, and I'm going to go back and watch it because I want to make sure that I'm understanding this the way that I think I am. But that would mean this, that Adam and Eve, they're evil. How many times do you see people defending their behavior as saying, it's not hurting anybody, it's not wrong, it's not really that big a deal, it's not really that wrong? Adam and Eve had the perfect example of what makes this fruit so wrong. Wouldn't you agree that when you hear that Adam and Eve ate a fruit, wouldn't you go, well, it feels like God's being a little petty? Was the fruit really, in light of all of the evil that we've seen, wouldn't you say that it's possible, the argument at just a base level, say, that seems a little petty that God would defend eating a fruit with all of these ramifications? In fairness, that's a fair argument if you don't understand evil. Because the evil, in this sense, wasn't the fruit. It was this. It was redirecting their love from God to anything else. To choose anything over the Word of God, that it was the choice. The choice was evil because it had God removed from it. So by choosing something less than God, Augustine's argument was that the evil was in the choosing. It was the act of redirecting their love from God and his word to themselves. And wouldn't you know, it says it was the tree of what? The knowledge of good and evil is introduced. Evil is when God is removed from something. So therefore, Adam and Eve chose to sever themselves from the presence of God. This is where it starts to get interesting, because evil in being nothing instead of something, it helps to, in my mind, we'll walk through it, it helps to understand this concept a little bit better. He said this, he said, evil is a perversion of free will turned aside from God to lesser things. Anytime you take your free will and you choose something less than God, that is evil. Now, here's the thing. I can open my door to my house, to my warm house, and let some cold in, and it doesn't mean that I'm instantly frozen all the way through. Just because you've experienced evil at a level that wasn't super damaging, it's not a justification for the evil. It's not to say that the evil's not really that bad or not really that painful. It's that we haven't experienced the fullness of separation from God. Actually, we as people don't experience separation from God this side of eternity. So none of us, even the most depraved of us, has never experienced full separation from God this side of eternity. We don't even fully recognize what evil truly is. We see the effects of people that have gone far out into their sin, far out into their evil, far into separation from God, and what that creates and the effects of that, but we still don't know what full separation from God looks like. So that means this. Think of it this way. They asked Jesus, they said, okay, all right, Jesus, what's the number one command? What's the number one commandment? What's the one thing? What's the one thing you'd say? And I'm just going to read it to you. In Mark chapter 12, verse 28, it says, one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating. Noticing that Jesus had given them a good answer, he said, of all the commandments, which one is the most important? Jesus said this. It says, the most important one, he answered, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then he says this. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Does that answer make more sense if evil is choosing less than God? He says if you never choose less than God, you will not experience evil. It's an explanation that says in the presence of God, the lack of God can't exist. That's a vacuum cleaner statement, I know, but think about it, just logically. It's because if you think of sin as being a thing, then if you chose evil, if you chose to do something evil, it's like God could go, well, you're playing for the wrong team and my feelings are hurt. Well, then why'd you create it? Why'd you create the opposite team? But that's not how evil evil works. Evil is the removal of God. So God says, as you draw closer to God, evil can't exist. In the same way that heat drives out cold or light drives out darkness. Light and darkness can't coexist. So God says, as you put God number one in your life, there's no ability for evil to exist in that. Does that logically, if we're guarding our reasoning this morning, does that from a reasoning standpoint make a little more sense? Because it's not like God saying, you should play for my team. God's saying, draw close to me so that you don't experience separation from me. For your good. Because I think sometimes we forget God doesn't need you to be God. God is God apart from you, and it's an invitation. But what Adam and Eve did is they separated. This is where, and I know this is going to be wonky, but I think you're following me. Adam and Eve chose separation from God. That means that even if God pursued them and they were in evil, by going to where they were, it wouldn't be evil because God would be there, right? So in concept, a philosophy lesson would say they were eternally and irreparably separated from God in darkness, in evil. Because they chose separation from God. Now, do you see why the role of Jesus becomes more important? That what Jesus did was impossible. Jesus' role was an impossible role because he said, I'll go to where God isn't. He was severed from God to go somewhere that God wasn't, to redeem you from being lost into being found. It's a very logical concept if you understand the ingredients to evil are nothing. That evil is not an active, it's a lack. So when God says, choose me, he's not saying don't choose the other team. He's saying choose what is real, choose what is life. Don't let your life be affected by the lack of goodness. The second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says this, there's no commandment greater than these. If I was going to steal something from you, I would have to love the item more than I love you. And if I love the item that I'm stealing more than I love you, that means that I don't love God, because to love God means I have to love you, because his word says, how can you love a God that you haven't seen when you won't love the person you have seen? So the evil in stealing is that I have chose to love a lesser good. See that? It's just redirecting my heart's affection from something good to something less good. And what that does is it separates. It draws me into the darkness. It draws me into the cold. It draws me away from who God is, from the nature of God. Because God says, love me first, love your neighbor as yourself. You get those two things right, there's no room. There's no room for evil to exist. Trace back every evil act we've ever seen committed, ever, what we'll find is that there was a lack of love for God and a lack of love for people. So, people were lost. And Colossians 1, verse 21 says, once you're alienated from, see if this, I love when a concept comes to mind and we understand it, and then we read the Word of God, and the Word of God makes more sense based on our understanding of a concept. Listen to this, Colossians 1:20, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. Not because God's judging you going, I don't like how you do that. It says you're evil. The evil, which is the separation from God, because you were in a place separated from God's presence. It's not personal. God's not petty. It's not that God was going, that was my favorite fruit and you ate it. He's saying you chose separation. He says because you were separated because of your evil behavior. Listen, but now he has reconciled you. That word reconciled, it may mean a little to us today, but in eternity, the word reconciled will be a huge word. Reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death. See what I mean? Through death, he sent his son somewhere that he wasn't. That's why it says that he was separated from God. Through death, he sent his own son somewhere he wasn't, so that you, through Jesus, could be reconciled to his holy sight without blemish and free from accusation. Okay, This is where we've gone as far down into the bad news. We're going to start to kind of come back up into the good news. Augustine had a word that he used that I hadn't really, honestly, it's not a word I use, but I like it. He said, it's not all bad. Evil is not all bad, because you could still be asking, okay, fine. You allowed a separation from yourself, but why would you even do that? We see the effects of evil. We see the evil is terrible, but why even that? I mean, that's still, in a sense, even if evil in and of itself, even if darkness is only the lack of light, you still bump into stuff. Even if cold is just a lack of heat, you still feel the effects of it. You could still go, God, why? And there's a word that Augustine used, and that word is plenitude. And it means, basically, it translates to superabundance. There is a superabundance because typical God fashion, he's able to take what is bad and from bad create better good. Plenitude, let me explain it to you. I wrote this down. This is the quote. It says, had there never been the reality of separation, the reality, you follow me, evil just being separation, just being the separation from God's presence. Had there never been that, there would have never been the reality, and I wrote this down, I love this list. Think of this, had it not been for the reality of separation, we would have never had words, and it's not even the word, there would have never been the thing, courage. What courage does it take if there's no risk? Courage is an invention brought on by the possibility of separation. Superabundance. It says that he created good that couldn't have existed before. That through there being the risk of bad, he even allows through the risk of bad for there to be better than good. I know that's a vacuum cleaner kind of statement, but it's true. Mercy, think of that. Where did mercy come from? Mercy was birthed in the concept of forgiveness, which, by the way, couldn't have existed without the potential for separation. The concept of forgiveness could have never been spawned had it not been for the reality that God allowed separation to be a possibility, and we chose to get to come back. We only got to choose to come back after he reconciled us. Do you see how all of a sudden, even in the midst of going, why was evil a thing? But we see all these amazing things that are birth things. Actual, real. See the difference between evil. Evil is a nothing. Mercy, forgiveness, courage, all these things are actual things that God has created in the face of bad circumstances. I'm going to read you the list. I could go on. Patience, heroism, perseverance, faithfulness, self-control, long-suffering, submission, obedience. None of those things could have existed without the potential of separation. So that means even in the face of bad, God is creating better than good. Now, I'm going to read you a quote. This is the part when you leave today, you'll be scratching your head on going, I don't know if I agree with this. This is actually stuff that Scott emailed back and goes, man, I don't know. So here's what I'll do because I'm so courageous. I'm going to separate myself from this, and I'm just going to tell you what Augustine said. And if you get mad, you can get mad at him. He died like a long time ago. Just as evil is the act of free will, so is virtue. Think of this. Virtue, all these things that you choose, your obedience that you choose. You couldn't have chosen if there wasn't the potential for failure, right? Virtue was created in this vacuum where evil was a thing. We'll start singing that one in a minute. So here's the rest of that quote. A world that had never been touched by evil would be a good place, but it wouldn't be the best place. Sorry, wait a minute. So evil's good? No. No, it's not. But because evil, and when I think of evil, don't think of it as an active, aggressive act of evil. Those are all just the results of separation. What you're seeing is someone so lost in darkness, so lost in cold, that they're operating completely separate from goodness. We see that and we go, oh, that's terrible, because we have an eye. We recognize goodness. We don't always recognize where it comes from. But it says in the face of the potential for that sort of terrible, we have now seen God operating on a level we could have never comprehended. Do you notice the Bible says that the angels are fixated on salvation? It says they never look away from it. that the angels, they look at you being saved by God and they're transfixed, they just can't look away because there's something about God's love being demonstrated in a forgiveness capacity that they can't ever experience. It's a part of God's love the angels can never experience because the angels have never been forgiven of anything. They look at you and they go, look at God at work, and look, they're getting to choose God. It's not that evil's good, it's that in the face of evil, God is creating better than could have existed without it. Isn't that interesting? So inevitably, this question's gonna come up. Inevitably, you're gonna think, okay, that's great. What about the people who suffer based on someone else's evil? That doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair that if this is all the case, and if, okay, fine, but what about the people who were innocently minding their own business, worshiping God, choosing God, and some gunman walks into a church, and what about them? What about the victims? Don't you kind of, okay, fine, but that doesn't seem fair. Deuteronomy 30, 3 through 13 says basically this: I will return everything that you've lost. I heard a sermon about a guy who had a dream. And in this dream, he said he was there. He witnessed all of it in his dream. He witnessed the slaughter of his family. If you've ever had one of those super realistic dreams, he said he was living it. He was there and he was feeling everything that he was feeling. He's experiencing it. And he said it's just the most horrific memories in his mind was a dream that didn't even happen, right? And he said when he wakes up, he said something changed, something happened. He said when I woke up and I realized it was a dream, it was like I had lost my family. But when I woke up, they'd been restored to me. I have visited with parents who have lost children, and you want to talk about a hopeless feeling. I've heard people say, God can never make this right. God took something from me that can never be restored. But if we think about this man said this. He said, I loved my family before, but when I experienced losing them, only to have them restored to me, it's like I loved them more. I loved them more than I could have had I not. I think sometimes when we think of evil as being this bad team and God being this good team, we don't understand that God has this desire to create good that couldn't have been accomplished otherwise. But his plan, it says that Jesus came to restore. What does restore mean? It means to bring back, to give back. That means this: nothing that's lost can't be regained in Christ. I want to read you this verse. 1 Timothy 4:4. We read the first half. It says, for everything God created is good. We read that already. The second half says, and nothing is to be rejected if it's received with thanksgiving. Have you ever had a time in your life where you read a verse that says everything is supposed to be received with thanksgiving and think, how dare you, God? How dare you ask me to receive what I'm receiving and be thankful for it? Who could be thankful for the things that I'm experiencing? Who could be thankful? God's saying everything that I've created is good and nothing that you've lost can't be given back. And this idea that we're going to get mad at God and choose a different route because we don't understand that what we're choosing, evil, think of this, evil in and of itself can't be chosen because evil in and of itself isn't a thing. In our anger and our frustration with God, humanity turns to nothing. We turn our affection, we turn our love to nothing, believing that God has somehow damaged us, not realizing that God owns time, that God owns eternity, and that nothing that we've lost can't be returned. But you are experiencing a part of God's love and suffering that couldn't have existed were you not suffering. So the suffering is temporary. Everything good will be returned to you. Evil in and of itself isn't even a thing and doesn't exist in a traditional sense. regarding our reasoning this morning. John 16:33 says this, I've told you these things so that you may have peace. And why would you need peace? In the midst of a world that is in complete chaos. I mean, look around. The world is in chaos. It says, I told you these things so you may have peace. Listen, it says, in this world you will have trouble. It's not like trouble sneaks up and God's like, now what? He says, no, you're going to have trouble. I told you these things so that in trouble you can have peace because, and this is where it ends, it says this. It says, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Is it a complete thesis on why do bad things exist? Not exactly. Not exactly, but if you've ever seen something so vile and so horrible and so awful that it makes you question everything, keep in mind that is the result of what things look like apart from God's presence. Everything God created is good. Everything that God created is good. So, did God create everything? Yes. Is evil a thing? Not really. Not in a sense. But he takes the opportunity created by a space of separation. He takes that opportunity to create better good than we could have experienced without it. I'm going to go back to what I said when we're done, but I want to go back to what I said. If you're somebody who goes, I don't understand it, but I trust God, that's kind of where we all are. We're never gonna completely fully understand it. We're never gonna completely be able to spell out every single detail or every fiber of why God does what he does. At the end, we do the best we can to answer the questions the best that we can, but in the end, what we're left with is, I don't know, but I trust a good God.